Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet. You can dim the lights, settle under a blanket, and let your brain slip into that pleasant, half-awake fog. Because tonight's story isn't about battles or samurai charging into glory. It's about the people who watched them from behind sliding doors. The children of shoguns, the ladies in waiting, the men with titles so long they needed two servants just to announce them. We're calling this one Rain on the Thatched Roof, the shogun's children, because that's exactly what their lives often felt like. A gentle drizzle of melancholy falling on golden cages. So, take a breath. Let's start where most over-entitled dynasties begin, with the illusion of control. Japan in the late medieval period loved a good hierarchy. It was practically a national hobby. Every family had a rank, and every rank had sub-ranks. And if you didn't know exactly where you fit, there was always someone eager to remind you, usually with a bow just shallow enough to be insulting. The shogun, technically, was the military ruler, a sort of generalissimo who ran things while the emperor stayed busy doing, well, mostly poetry and ceremonial breathing. And if that sounds like a strange division of labor, it was. But it worked. For a while. The shogun's children, though, had the kind of upbringing that could make a psychologist weep with gratitude. Imagine being told from birth that you're divinely appointed, but also that you can't leave the palace, speak to strangers, or eat unapproved fish. Their lives were a contradiction in silk. Absolute privilege wrapped around absolute boredom. Let's start with one of my personal favorites, the Ashikaga shoguns, who ruled Japan from the 1330s to the 1570s. They were the kind of family that made dysfunctional look like a brand. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, for instance, the third shogun, loved art, gold, and being admired. He built the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto, which is now one of the most photographed buildings in Japan. He also spent roughly the GDP of a small island nation decorating it, because restraint wasn't really his strong suit. He declared himself King of Japan, in correspondence with the Chinese emperor, which was bold considering the Japanese emperor was still technically alive and probably frowning politely somewhere nearby. Yoshimitsu's court glittered, literally. Perfumed robes, incense smoke curling in the air, and enough lacquerware to blind the gods. But inside that beauty lived a streak of sadness and decay. The shogun's children were raised like precious bonsai, trimmed, curated, never allowed to grow freely. A shogun's son could expect an education that was equal parts Confucian philosophy and strict etiquette. You learned calligraphy before you learned how to run. You memorized poems about impermanence, while your tutors quietly despaired over your handwriting. Punishments were rare, because punishments were vulgar. Disapproval was far more effective. The silent look from an elder could melt through lacquer armor. Most boys were promised important posts by age 6. At 7, they might already have their own retainers, a miniature bureaucracy orbiting a miniature person. And at 8 or 9, the realization hit. They would never actually do anything. Their future was paperwork, ceremonies, and endless dinners where no one laughed too loudly. The daughters of the elite lived even quieter lives. They were taught music, poetry, and the fine art of pretending not to exist. Marriage wasn't romance, it was logistics, a political alliance dressed in layers of silk. And the higher your birth, the smaller your world became. Some lived their whole lives within one estate, walking the same polished corridors day after day, listening to rain on the thatched roof and wondering what the outside smelled like. Letters became their escape, beautifully written, carefully folded, carried by servants who knew better than to peek. In those letters, you glimpsed the humanity peeking through the lacquer, women who joked, complained, fell in love with the idea of freedom. One noblewoman wrote that she envied the sound of frogs outside her window. Imagine that, being jealous of amphibians because they could go wherever they pleased. By the 15th century, the shogunate was less military government and more very fancy suggestion service. Regional warlords, the daimyo, did what they wanted, while Kyoto's aristocrats continued holding poetry contests and pretending everything was fine. The children born into that fading world inherited a strange combination of arrogance and anxiety. They were raised to rule, but the world was moving on without them. Some reacted by retreating into art. Ashikaga Yoshimasa, for example, the 8th shogun, basically gave up on politics and invented aesthetic minimalism instead. He built the Silver Pavilion and popularized the idea that imperfection could be beautiful, mostly because everything around him was falling apart and he needed a philosophical excuse. His home became the cradle of wabi-sabi, the beauty of the incomplete, or, as his ministers might have called it, the beauty of not fixing anything. For elite children, life was a cycle of ceremonies. Every event had a ritual. Every movement had meaning. Even playtime was structured. Boys practiced archery with blunted arrows, but no one really cared if they hit the target. The form mattered more than the outcome. Girls painted fans, composed poetry, and tried not to faint from the weight of their hairstyles.
Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially lasted longer than most Tokugawa ministers in a budget meeting. If you're drifting, even better. Because this next stretch of our story is meant to be heard, not studied. So loosen your shoulders, let your jaw unclench, and imagine the soft creak of a palace hallway where the air always smells faintly of tatami and candle smoke. By the mid-18th century, Japan was peaceful, eerily peaceful. No foreign wars, no samurai rebellions, not even a respectable scandal to gossip about. The country had become a snow globe, perfectly arranged, endlessly shaken, never changed. And at the very center sat the Tokugawa heirs, children born into stillness. The 8th shogun, Yoshimune, had been a rare thing, a ruler with energy. He reformed taxes, reduced spending, and occasionally left his house. But his descendants learned a different lesson, that initiative was dangerous because it made people look at you. By the time we reach his great-grandson, Ieyaharu, the shogun's palace had become a museum that happened to contain living people. Ieyaharu was polite, educated, and emotionally beige. He wrote haiku about dew on pine needles, which critics later described as technically adequate. He preferred miniature gardens to governing. And honestly, same. The empire practically ran itself on paperwork and habit. Ministers signed edicts in his name while he adjusted bonsai trees and wondered if enlightenment was just really intense boredom. Edo Castle, by this point, was a masterpiece of regulated existence. Hours were divided by bells, each echoing through layers of corridors until even the dust bowed in rhythm. Servants moved like shadows, always 2 steps behind, never seen doing anything human like sneezing. Children born there didn't cry loudly. They had attendants who anticipated tears and solved them before sound occurred. A child's world was made of sliding doors, hushed instructions, and the endless rustle of silk. Outside, rain fell on tile and pine. Inside, time had texture, slow, sticky, ceremonial. One young prince collected European clocks, sent as gifts from Dutch traders in Nagasaki. He didn't understand their mechanisms, but he liked the ticking. Each beat was a reminder that somewhere, beyond the moat, time actually moved forward. The Tokugawa bureaucracy was so efficient it made its rulers irrelevant. It's the dream of every administrator, a government that survives on autopilot. Regional lords filed reports, taxes arrived on schedule, and samurai filled out paperwork confirming they'd done nothing of note. For the shogun's children, that meant growing up surrounded by power they would never need to use. Imagine inheriting a sword so sacred you're forbidden to draw it. Generations learned diplomacy by watching elders bow for precisely the correct number of seconds. The result was grace without purpose, a nation choreographed into stillness. While the men perfected ceremonial boredom, the women curated serenity as an art form. The Ooku, the women's quarter of Edo Castle, was effectively a kingdom of whispers. Thousands lived there, ranked by family, beauty, and sheer endurance. Their duties? Exist elegantly. Most would never see the outside world again. Some found meaning in poetry, others in rivalry disguised as etiquette. They traded rumors like contraband sweets. Occasionally, a concubine rose high enough to bear a shogun's child, a promotion that came with new silk robes and lifelong isolation. One diary from a lady-in-waiting simply reads, "Today the plum tree bloomed, the same as yesterday." It's both tragic and deeply relatable. Down in Osaka, the merchant class was accidentally inventing capitalism. They weren't supposed to be rich, money was vulgar, but somehow their warehouses kept overflowing. They bought art, sponsored theaters, and quietly mocked the nobility by living better than them. Back in Edo, the shogun's offspring read moral essays warning against greed while wearing silk woven by those very merchants. Contradiction had become culture. A daimyo could quote Confucius on frugality while commissioning a gold leaf tea bowl the size of his ego. Ianari, the 11th shogun, ruled for 50 years, a record, mostly because he refused to retire. He loved luxury with the sincerity of a man who'd never paid for anything. He built new palaces, collected concubines, and organized banquets that could feed small prefectures. Yet even he felt the weight of stillness. Letters describe him sitting for hours just listening to rain. He envied peasants who got wet. Imagine craving inconvenience so badly you fantasize about mud. He once ordered an indoor storm experience. Servants sprinkled water outside paper walls while musicians mimicked thunder on drums. It was said he smiled, briefly. For the next generation, childhood became rehearsal for formality. At 5, they bowed correctly. At 7, they spoke in honorifics that required linguistic acrobatics. At 10, they could recite entire lineages of ancestors, each name another reminder that originality was not the point. Servants recorded every milestone in elegant handwriting: first tooth, first poem, first acceptable display of sadness. Play was supervised, no running, no shouting, no joy uncurated. Their toys were lacquer boxes in miniature pelicans. Even imagination had a hierarchy. And when adolescence came, so did arranged futures, temple, marriage, or quiet disappearance. Choice was a myth told by wandering poets. While Edo perfected immobility, the rest of the planet discovered gunpowder diplomacy. Ships crossed oceans, empires swapped maps like trading cards, and somewhere across the Pacific, people started calling that whole exchange globalization. Japan, meanwhile, maintained its splendid isolation. The only sanctioned contact was through Dutch traders at Dejima, a man-made island small enough to miss if you blinked. Through them trickled books, clocks, and the faint rumor that reality elsewhere was messy and loud. A few curious minds within the shogun's court peeked at these foreign toys and wondered if the outside might be worth the noise. They didn't say it out loud, heresy ruins careers, but they wrote poems about horizons anyway. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the 13th shogun, was perhaps the most delicate of them all. Sickly since childhood, he disliked confrontation and sunshine. He blushed easily, spoke softly, and seemed perpetually startled by existence. Ministers handled state affairs while he focused on survival and proper posture. When foreign ships finally arrived demanding trade in the 1850s, Iyasada's reaction was reportedly confusion mixed with mild terror, not ideal leadership qualities during an invasion of gunboats. Diplomats described him as gracious but uncertain, which is diplomatic for please don't make eye contact. His death at 34 closed the curtain on centuries of hereditary composure. Japan's walls, both literal and psychological, were about to crack. Rain on tile, thunder far away. The year is 1867. The 15th and final shogun, Yoshinobu, paces beneath the eaves of Edo Castle. He's educated, modern-minded, and painfully aware that his ancestors' stillness has become a trap. Outside, the world hums with industrial noise. Inside, every footstep echoes like history clearing its throat. He tries to reform things, opens schools, reads Western science, even poses for a photograph, a scandalous act of realism. But it's too late. The Meiji Restoration is coming, polite as a guest, but unstoppable as dawn. When Yoshinobu finally surrenders power, he does so with perfect etiquette, the ultimate Tokugawa gesture. Even the end of an era must not disturb the tea ceremony. The shogun's children fade into private life. Some become scholars, others painters. A few simply vanish into ordinary society, anonymous at last. The rain still falls on Edo, now Tokyo, but no one bows to it anymore. The castles crumble politely, the gardens overgrow their gondries, and somewhere in a museum drawer, a child's lacquer box still holds a tiny poem about the beauty of things that end. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the echo of ritual dissolving into modern noise, the sigh of a dynasty realizing it was mortal all along.
The rain had changed its mind again. It no longer fell in quick bursts like the summer storms that used to drum against the paper shutters of Edo. Instead, it came softly now, as if remembering the way once sounded on the old thatched roofs of the countryside, long before the shogun's palaces turned into ministries, and long before the city forgot that it had ever smelled of wood smoke. This was a different kind of quiet, not the disciplined silence of a samurai court, but the heavier quiet that comes after history has said everything it meant to say. The last shogun, Yoshinobu, liked that kind of weather. He said it made the air honest. It blurred the lines between rich and poor, emperor and clerk. Everyone simply became wet, equalized by drizzle in Shizuoka, his seaside retreat. The gulls didn't care that he had once ruled Japan. They circled lazily, waiting for the tide to bring them breakfast. And he watched them through his new camera, a Western marvel of glass and brass that ticked faintly as he adjusted the focus. Sometimes the gulls blurred. Sometimes the world did. Perhaps it didn't matter. The result was always a picture of patience. He had spent most of his life rehearsing composure, and now that the stage lights of politics were gone, he performed the same role for himself. He rose at 6, took tea with measured movements, read the morning papers with the slight squint of a man pretending he needed glasses just to seem scholarly, then walked the garden paths until the gardeners politely bowed him back indoors. The neighbors called him the gentleman by the sea. No one said shogun anymore. It was considered old-fashioned and slightly rude, like calling someone by a job they were fired from decades ago. Yoshinobu didn't mind. He had grown fond of being ordinary, which for a man of his lineage was an almost revolutionary act. Around him, Japan was learning the uncomfortable skill of speed. The Meiji bureaucrats filed laws faster than they could read them. Railways appeared like impatient brushstrokes across the islands. Merchants became businessmen, craftsmen became manufacturers, and farmers became statistics. Everything that once required a bow now required a signature. The old samurai families watched from their shrinking estates, politely confused. They had been told that loyalty was eternal. Now they were told it was inefficient. They were used to measuring value in swords and poems. Now it was measured in yen. One could almost hear the collective sigh of ancestors echoing through the tatami mats. Yoshinobu was practical enough not to argue. He knew that history rarely repeated itself. It simply changed the subject. Still, there were days when nostalgia crept in with the mist. He would hold his old armor, polished but unused, and think how heavy it must have felt on his younger self. He could barely lift it now. The lacquered plates reflected his face in distorted pieces, a reminder that even glory oxidizes. He smiled and set it back on its stand. The past looked better standing still, anyway. At dinner, he drank French wine, because apparently civilization now came with corks and labels. He preferred sake, but he said nothing. His guests were diplomats and engineers, men who discussed progress with the solemnity once reserved for ancestors. Yoshinobu nodded at all the right moments, occasionally wondering if progress had a smell, and if it did, whether it was pleasant. Meanwhile, Tokyo grew restless. The new capital hummed with ambition. The streets that had once echoed with samurai clogs now rattled with carriages and the faint electric buzz of street lamps imported from somewhere in Europe. The people were proud, but also slightly unsure of what exactly they were proud of. The emperor's portrait hung in schools, but the shogunate's etiquette still ruled households. Children recited patriotic poems in the morning, then bowed to grandmothers who corrected their posture according to rules older than the nation itself. This was how Japan modernized, not by erasing the past, but by folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer labeled tradition. The descendants of the Tokugawa line adapted in small, dignified ways. One cousin opened a private academy teaching girls to read French novels. Another joined the foreign ministry and spent evenings translating telegrams into elegant confusion. The family still held tea ceremonies, though now the guests included railway investors instead of retainers. They still spoke softly, still arranged flowers in vases shaped like small philosophies. The world thought they were relics, but they thought the world was loud, and that seemed fair enough. Sometimes their gardens were visited by journalists who came searching for the ghost of feudal Japan. They always found it, smiling behind a fan, pretending not to notice the camera. Yoshinobu lived long enough to witness airplanes, though he didn't trust them. He once said they reminded him of overly confident birds. He preferred bicycles. They stayed closer to the ground. He owned one himself, a gift from a foreign envoy. He rode it in circles within his compound, never on the main road. It amused the servants who pretended not to laugh. Perhaps history would have been kinder if more generals had owned bicycles, he thought. You couldn't start many wars at that speed. What he truly admired, though, was the clock, the Western obsession with measuring time instead of respecting it. The shogunate had once ruled by calendars, lunar festivals, and seasons, but the new world ticked in minutes. Factories required punctuality, and people now apologized for being late to things that never mattered. Yoshinobu hung a large clock in his study. It chimed politely every hour, reminding him that eternity was now divisible. He never wound it fully, he said. He liked to see how long order lasted without interference. The newspapers occasionally mentioned him when they needed a nostalgic headline. The last shogun still alive, the living memory of feudal Japan. The journalists expected wisdom. What they got were mild observations about the weather and the state of local fishing. He never offered regret, only small talk, perhaps because regret requires energy, and he had finally run out of kingdoms to manage. When he died in 1913,
The obituaries called him a man of quiet dignity, which was the polite way of saying he had the good sense to stop before history embarrassed him. After his death, the Tokugawa legacy became a kind of aesthetic, more museum than bloodline. Their crests decorated souvenir boxes, their portraits hung in tea rooms, their swords in glass cases. The nation that once knelt before them now queued politely to view them. It was strangely fitting. Even in defeat, they maintained order. People still bowed before the display signs without knowing why. Tradition has its own muscle memory. Japan moved forward, but its shadow walked backward at the same pace. In the years that followed, war came twice with the inevitability of rain. History no longer whispered, it shouted and burned cities. Yet somehow through it all, the Tokugawa gardens survived, miraculously untouched by bombs, as if the plains respected the geometry of stillness. After the surrender, when everything felt too loud again, the gardens reopened, moss growing where soldiers once trained, and koi circling as if rehearsing calm. The new visitors were schoolchildren and Americans, both equally curious about the meaning of peace. The guide spoke softly, explaining that this pond was once part of a lord's meditation routine, and this tree was older than the concept of democracy. Everyone nodded, as if that explained something essential about endurance. The Tokugawa descendants adjusted again. Some became professors, others curators. One even opened a coffee shop in Ginza, decorated with framed scrolls and subtle irony. Customers ordered cappuccinos under the watchful eyes of calligraphy that read, "Impermanence." There was no marketing gimmick, just atmosphere, which in modern Japan is another form of power. Every few years, a magazine would rediscover the family, printing glossy photos of poised descendants in impeccable suits. The articles always used the same words: grace, heritage, quiet dignity. It was as if the journalists feared disturbing the ghosts with originality. But ghosts are patient. They don't require acknowledgement. They exist in tone, not in text. If you listen closely to the rhythm of a Tokyo morning, the soft beep of a train card reader, the chorus of umbrellas opening in sync, you can hear something ancient, a collective discipline inherited from centuries of rehearsed restraint. It isn't about obedience anymore. It's about rhythm, the one thing that Tokugawa truly mastered. And so the rain still falls, as it always did, not as
The city kept moving, even when it wasn't sure where it was going. The electric lines hummed over streets that had once been moats, and the air smelled faintly of iron and rain. People worked longer hours than they needed to because it felt impolite to stop. Ambition had replaced loyalty, but it behaved in much the same way: quiet, disciplined, endlessly bowing to deadlines. Tokyo's skyline rose like a polite argument, every year a little taller, every window pretending to reflect the future in perfect symmetry. And yet somewhere, deep in the rhythm of the place, there was still that ancient pulse that measured time by patience, not by progress. It was in the way an old man watered his bonsai before sunrise, or how a clerk folded his umbrella precisely 3 times before stepping inside a train carriage. Nobody told them to do it. It was just the way things had always been done. In Shizuoka, the old Tokugawa residence remained a museum of understatement. Visitors removed their shoes. The floors creaked in all the right places. The smell of tatami still sharp and clean like dry grass after rain. The guides spoke in gentle tones, trained to glide over centuries without disturbing them. This room, they would say, was where the shogun once wrote poetry about clouds. This garden was designed for quiet contemplation, and this stone lantern was imported from Kyoto, as if distance itself had once been a kind of ornament. Outside, school children tried to sketch the pond, their pencils scratching like faint insects against paper.
their teachers shushing them with the same reverence once reserved for priests. Yoshinobu's ghost must have been pleased. Somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. In modern Japan, ghosts have excellent job security. They live in corners and rituals, in the habit of bowing twice at shrines, even if you no longer believe in anything. They survive in politeness, in the careful phrasing of apologies, and the art of never saying no directly. Perhaps the Tokugawa didn't lose their country, they simply outsourced it to etiquette. The empire collapsed, but manners never did. Even in the bright chaos of Shibuya Crossing, where thousands move at once, there is no collision, just choreography. The world calls it efficiency, but maybe it's inherited grace. And then there were the family archives, quiet rooms full of paper, the texture of dried leaves, the handwriting delicate and resigned, each document a fossil of authority, petitions, edicts, poetry, shopping lists written with equal precision. The curators sometimes found themselves staring at those brushstrokes, trying to imagine the hands that made them, the same hands that once signed decrees of war, now preserved under glass for tourists to photograph. The irony was perfect, and perfectly Japanese. Even power here knew how to age gracefully. One of Yoshinobu's great-grandsons became a historian himself, not of his family, but of agriculture. He said it felt less vain to study rice than rulers. When asked about his heritage, he shrugged, said it was like inheriting an echo. You can't spend it, you can only listen to it. Occasionally, he would be invited to speak at events marking anniversaries of the Edo period. He would stand on stage, bow politely, and remind the audience that his ancestors' greatest achievement was knowing when to stop fighting. Everyone clapped because it was true, and also because clapping fills silence better than thought. Some nights he dreamed of the old city, even though he'd never seen it. Wooden bridges, lantern light, the faint rattle of carts on wet stone. He imagined his ancestor walking there too, head slightly bowed, umbrella angled against the drizzle, both of them tourists in the same memory. Japan has a way of folding time so that the past is never really behind you. It walks beside you, quietly carrying your schedule. By the late 19th century, the Tokugawa name had become comfortably antique, like fine porcelain kept on display but never used. It appeared in textbooks, in calligraphy exhibitions, and in the occasional television drama where actors with impossibly straight posture reenacted scenes of serene authority. Audiences loved it because it was safe. Nostalgia polished and declawed. You could admire the samurai without the inconvenience of remembering the wars they caused. It was history as a lullaby, and perhaps that was the most fitting tribute of all. The gardens endured through earthquakes and redevelopment projects, somehow untouched by necessity. Urban planners found ways to build highways around them as if unwilling to test whatever invisible contract kept them sacred. The gardeners worked with the same patience as their ancestors, trimming branches with tiny scissors, talking softly to the trees. No one thought it strange. Here, nature and ritual shared the same vocabulary. Tourists wandered through, taking photos, but never lingering too long, as if aware that lingering was itself impolite. The air felt slower inside those gates, like the world outside had been placed on pause. Every new generation of the Tokugawa line found itself slightly further from relevance and slightly freer because of it. They studied abroad, worked in universities, ran art galleries, a few married commoners without scandal. The family crest appeared occasionally at weddings, funerals, and on letterheads for cultural foundations. It no longer represented power, just memory, a kind of tasteful melancholy. They wore it the way others wear perfume, a scent of origins faint but intentional. The 20th century tested everyone's composure. War, industrialization, defeat, occupation, Reconstruction. Through it all, Japan managed to look calm, even when it wasn't. The Tokugawa descendants, too, played their part, appearing at national ceremonies, smiling with an expertise inherited from centuries of polite disaster. They understood that history was mostly posture, the right angle of a bow, the exact duration of silence before applause. After all, what is dignity if not choreography under pressure? In post-war Tokyo, when neon replaced lanterns and jazz replaced temple bells, the idea of old Japan became a marketing category. But it was also a comfort. People needed proof that their identity hadn't melted entirely into concrete and light. So tea ceremonies returned as cultural heritage, kimonos as fashion statements, temples as tourist destinations. Every gesture that once belonged to power now belonged to peace. It was the most elegant rebranding campaign in human history. And somewhere beneath it all, you could almost hear Yoshinobu's ghost exhaling with approval. He would have recognized the irony. The shogunate had tried to freeze Japan in time, to protect it from chaos. Now modern Japan had learned to sell that same stillness as luxury. Tea houses charged admission for serenity, calligraphers offered workshops in mindfulness. Corporations sent executives to meditate where monks once meditated by necessity. Tranquility had become profitable, which at least guaranteed its survival. In the quieter parts of Tokyo, older residents still tell stories of the Edo period, their voices soft and factual, as if describing the weather. My grandfather used to say the samurai were always early, or that the city smelled of river water and soy smoke. These stories drift through generations like faint incense, not entirely believed, but too pleasant to discard. Memory here isn't about accuracy, it's about rhythm. Each retelling sands away a little more detail until what remains is texture, a lullaby disguised as history. At night, when the trains slow and the city hum evens out, you can almost imagine the old capital again. Lantern reflections in puddles, voices carrying through rain. There's a strange peace in knowing that so much noise can hide so much quiet. Maybe that's the true legacy of the shoguns. They taught a nation that silence doesn't mean absence, it just means intention. And so Japan keeps balancing between motion and meditation, endlessly building and bowing, inventing and remembering. The Tokugawa line may have ended as rulers, but their aesthetic survived as national temperament. Stillness without stagnation, discipline without cruelty, elegance without need for applause. In a way, they won the long game. The empire that followed them burned itself out twice, but their version of control remains alive in every polite nod, every measured pause, every train announcement that apologizes for a 40-second delay. If Yoshinobu could see it now, he would probably smile faintly, maybe adjust his camera lens and remark that the composition was finally balanced. The people had inherited his favorite illusion, peace that moves just slow enough to look eternal. The rain would still be falling, of course, because in Japan it always is, not out of sadness, but continuity, a reminder that even clouds know how to be punctual. The city kept moving, even when it wasn't sure where it was going. The electric lines hummed over streets that had once been moats, and the air smelled faintly of iron and rain. People worked longer hours than they needed to because it felt impolite to stop. Ambition had replaced loyalty, but it behaved in much the same way. Quiet, disciplined, endlessly bowing to deadlines. Tokyo's skyline rose like a polite argument. Every year, a little taller, every window pretending to reflect the future in perfect symmetry. And yet, somewhere deep in the rhythm of the place, there was still that ancient pulse that measured time by patience, not by progress. It was in the way an old man watered his bonsai before sunrise, or how a clerk folded his umbrella precisely 3 times before stepping inside a train carriage. Nobody told them to do it. It was just the way things had always been done. In Shizuoka, the old Tokugawa residence remained museum of understatement. Visitors removed their shoes, the floors creaked in all the right places, the smell of tatamins still sharp and clean like dry grass after rain. The The guides spoke in gentle tones, trained to glide over centuries without disturbing them. This room, they would say, was where the shogun once wrote poetry about clouds. This garden was designed for quiet contemplation, and this stone lantern was imported from Kyoto, as if distance itself had once been a kind of ornament. Outside, schoolchildren tried to sketch the pond, their pencils scratching like faint insects against paper, their teachers shushing them with the same reverence once reserved for priests. Yoshinobu's ghost must have been pleased, somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. In modern Japan, ghosts have excellent job security. They live in corners, in rituals, in the habit of bowing twice at shrines, even if you no longer believe in anything. They survive in politeness, in the careful phrasing of apologies, and the art of never saying no directly. Perhaps the Tokugawa didn't lose their country, they simply outsourced it to etiquette. The empire collapsed, but manners never did. Even in the bright chaos of Shibuya Crossing, where thousands move at once, there is no collision, just choreography. The world calls it efficiency, but maybe it's inherited grace. And then there were the family archives, quiet rooms full of paper, the texture of dried leaves, the handwriting delicate and resigned, each document a fossil of authority. Petitions, edicts, poetry, shopping lists, written with equal precision. The curators sometimes found themselves staring at those brushstrokes, trying to imagine the hands that made them, the same hands that once signed decrees of war, now preserved under glass for tourists to photograph. The irony was perfect, and perfectly Japanese. Even power here knew how to age gracefully. One of Yoshinobu's great-grandsons became a historian himself, not of his family but of agriculture. He said it felt less vain to study rice than rulers. When asked about his heritage, he shrugged, said it was like inheriting an echo. You can't spend it, you can only listen to it occasionally. He would be invited to speak at events marking anniversaries of the Edo period. He would stand on stage, bow politely, and remind the audience that his ancestors' greatest achievement was knowing when to stop fighting. Everyone clapped, because it was true, and also because clapping fills silence better than thought. Some nights he dreamed of the old city, even though he'd never seen it. Wooden bridges, lantern light, the faint rattle of carts on wet stone. He imagined his ancestor walking there too, head slightly bowed, umbrella angled against the drizzle, both of them tourists in the same memory. Japan has a way of folding time so that the past is never really behind you. It walks beside you, quietly carrying your schedule. By the late 20th century, the Tokugawa name had become comfortably antique, like fine porcelain kept on display but never used. It appeared in textbooks, in calligraphy exhibitions, and in the occasional television drama, where actors with impossibly straight posture reenacted scenes of serene authority. Audiences loved it because it was safe, nostalgia, polished, and declawed. You could admire the samurai without the inconvenience of remembering the wars they caused. It was history as a lullaby, and perhaps that was the most fitting tribute of all. The gardens endured through earthquakes and redevelopment projects, somehow untouched by necessity. Urban planners found ways to build highways around them, as if unwilling to test whatever invisible contract kept them sacred. The gardeners worked with the same patience as their ancestors, trimming branches with tiny scissors, talking softly to the trees. No one thought it strange. Here, nature and ritual shared the same vocabulary. Tourists wandered through taking photos, but never lingering too long, as if aware that lingering was itself impolite. The air felt slower inside those gates, like the world outside had been placed on pause. Every new generation of the Tokugawa line found itself slightly further from relevance and slightly freer because of it. They studied abroad, worked in universities, ran art galleries, a few married commoners without scandal. The crest appeared occasionally at weddings, funerals, and on letterheads for cultural foundations. It no longer represented power, just memory, a kind of tasteful melancholy. They wore it the way others wear perfume, a scent of origins, faint but intentional. The 20th century tested everyone's composure. War, industrialization, defeat, occupation, reconstruction. Through it all, Japan managed to look calm, even when it wasn't. The Tokugawa descendants, too, played their part, appearing at national ceremonies, smiling with an expertise inherited from centuries of polite disaster. They understood that history was mostly posture, the right angle of a bow, the exact duration of silence before applause. After all, what is dignity if not choreography under pressure? In post-war Tokyo, when neon replaced lanterns and jazz replaced temple bells, the idea of old Japan became a marketing category, but it was also a comfort. People needed proof that their identity hadn't melted entirely into concrete and light. So tea houses returned as cultural heritage, kimonos as fashion statements, temples as tourist destinations. Every gesture that once belonged to power now belonged to peace. It was the most elegant rebranding campaign in human history, and somewhere beneath it all, you could almost hear Yoshinobu's ghost exhaling with approval. He would have recognized the irony. The shogunate had tried to freeze Japan in time, to protect it from chaos. Now modern Japan had learned to sell that same stillness as luxury. Tea houses charged admission for serenity, calligraphers offered workshops in mindfulness, corporations sent executives to meditate where monks once meditated by necessity. Tranquility had become profitable, which at least guaranteed its survival. In the quieter parts of Tokyo, older residents still tell stories of the Edo period, their voices soft and factual, as if describing the weather. My grandfather used to say the samurai were always early, or that the city smelled of river water and soy smoke. These stories drift through generations like faint incense, not entirely believed but too pleasant to discard. Memory here isn't about accuracy, it's about rhythm. Each retelling sands away a little more detail until what remains is texture, a lullaby disguised as history. At night, when the trains slow and the city hum evens out, you can almost imagine the old capital again. Lantern reflections in puddles, voices carrying through rain. There is a strange peace in knowing that so much noise can hide so much quiet. Maybe that's the true legacy of the shoguns. They taught a nation that silence doesn't mean absence. It just means intention. And so Japan keeps balancing between motion and meditation, endlessly building and bowing, inventing and remembering. The Tokugawa line may have ended as rulers, but their aesthetic survived as national temperament. Stillness without stagnation, discipline without cruelty, elegance without need for applause. In a way, they won the long game. The empire that followed them burned itself out twice, but their version of control remains alive in every polite nod, every measured pause, every train announcement that apologizes for a 40-second delay. If Yoshinobu could see it now, he would probably smile faintly, maybe adjust his camera lens and remark that the composition was finally balanced. The people had inherited his favorite illusion, peace that moves just slow enough to look eternal. The rain would still be falling, of course, because in Japan it always is. Not out of sadness, but continuity. A reminder that even clouds know how to be punctual.
As the night deepened, the village settled into a near-perfect hush. The occasional cough or whisper punctuated the darkness like punctuation marks in a story that had been unfolding for generations. The lanterns swayed gently with the wind, casting soft, wavering shadows across mud walls and wet paths. The rice paddies reflected the faint light, producing a subtle shimmer that made the entire landscape appear liquid, yet ordered in some secret geometry only the villagers understood. The children, already sleepy from their day, lay on mats in their small homes, listening to the rain's gentle percussion, which seemed louder at night because the world had slowed its movements,
in deference to darkness. Some of them murmured to themselves, half asleep, the simple rhythms of counting the steps in the rice paddies or the number of times a crow had flown past the fence earlier in the afternoon. In a neighboring hamlet, an elderly farmer stirred a pot over the fire, blowing gently to maintain the heat. He added small bits of root and water from the river, tasting carefully as he went. His movements were unhurried yet precise, the result of decades of repetition. He could feel the day's work in every muscle, yet the satisfaction of a task well completed brought a faint, almost imperceptible smile. He knew that tomorrow and the day after, the same work would continue, and that knowledge brought comfort, not dread. The pattern of labor itself was its own narrative, a story told in mud, water, and rice, unfolding slowly enough that one could follow it in detail without missing a beat. Beyond the central square, a small shrine emitted faint incense smoke that mingled with the earthy scent of rain. The village priest knelt before the altar, muttering prayers to deities whose names were as old as the mountains behind them. He spoke softly, rhythmically, invoking blessings for crops, health, and the occasional absent traveler. The words themselves were simple, but the cadence mattered more than the meaning. A child standing nearby repeated them aloud incorrectly, and the priest corrected the pronunciation gently, not out of irritation, but out of ritual care. Even the animals seemed to respect the sacred space. A cat perched quietly on the roof's edge, observing the proceedings with detached curiosity. A small dog lay curled beneath a lantern post, its tail flicking in measured intervals like a metronome. The rain changed rhythm occasionally, softening almost to a whisper, then returning in gentle taps against bamboo gutters. The villagers adjusted seamlessly, pulling cloaks tighter, moving buckets, adjusting firewood piles, as if the weather were a companion rather than an inconvenience. The rhythm of daily life, of planting, of tending animals, of cooking, of mending, was in constant harmony with the external environment. No one spoke of time in the modern sense, yet all knew instinctively when the next task should begin. The apprentice at the blacksmith's forge measured metal by eye and ear, judging its temperature by the faint hiss when it hit water, rather than by any instrument, because in this life, understanding came from repetition, observation, and internalization. Along the winding paths that connected villages, travelers moved slowly through puddles, their straw hats wet and dripping little rivulets on the path below. Each person carried the minimal items necessary for travel: a satchel, a bundle of rice cakes, a small knife, sometimes a tiny wrapped bundle of clothing. Their pace was measured, careful, as if the world outside the village demanded respect, not haste. Along these same paths, merchants occasionally passed carrying baskets of dried fish, bundles of cloth, small pottery jars. The villagers observed them politely, offering quiet nods of acknowledgement. The merchants responded similarly, understanding without words that this rhythm was not negotiable. Any sudden acceleration would be met with polite disapproval and perhaps a whispered story to accompany it in the next village. Inside a thatched house, a mother soothed a crying infant with gentle hums. The melody simple, cyclical, more about repetition than tune. She rocked the child slowly in a cradle fashioned from bamboo and cloth. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, adding warmth and a subtle soundtrack to the night. The father, tired from the day's labor in the fields, traced his hand over the smooth surface of the table, feeling the faint ridges left by wood grain and the occasional nick left by decades of careful use. Each object in the home seemed to carry history, ordinary yet continuous, each scratch a marker of existence in a world where permanence was measured by the persistence of habit rather than monuments or written law. Outside, the forest beyond the village hummed softly. The rain-slicked leaves reflected faint light, and every branch dripped in unison. A fox passed quietly, barely disturbing the undergrowth. A group of crows, previously more active, had roosted in the trees, heads tucked into feathers and bodies perfectly still. The wind carried faint scents of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the river's flow winding through the valley, all combining into a lullaby so subtle that one could barely tell where one sound ended and another began. This lullaby was not for performance. It was not composed consciously. It simply existed, as life does, measured, repetitive, comforting. In another household, a young apprentice learned the art of weaving under the supervision of an older sister who herself had learned from their mother, who had learned from their grandmother. The threads, pulled taut across the loom, moved under the hands of the student, slowly, patiently, guided by rhythm more than instruction. The shuttle moved back and forth, producing a tight, precise fabric. The elder watched silently, interjecting only when necessary, sometimes adjusting tension with gentle pressure, sometimes correcting a misaligned row of stitches. The work was monotonous, but the monotony was a kind of meditation, and the apprentice felt herself sinking into the pattern of it, losing awareness of rain, wind, or day entirely. The river, central to multiple hamlets, carried water from mountains to paddies, its flow slow and deliberate. The villagers occasionally stopped to observe, measuring depth and speed, ensuring irrigation channels functioned smoothly. Any disruption in the water's rhythm would have consequences, but no one panicked. Instead, they adjusted quietly, methodically, making small interventions and returning to routine. The river itself seemed to understand, as if it too participated in the collective patience, moving precisely enough to nourish, slowly enough to avoid destruction. Further along, a traveling poet passed from village to village. He carried a small notebook, a brush, and a faintly melancholic expression. He did not hurry his steps. He did not speak loudly. He simply observed the minutiae of life, the placement of a wooden bucket, the angle of a roof, the spacing of rice stalks, the way the children's eyes followed the monk's movements and wrote them down in delicate kanji that seemed to reflect not words but breath itself. Each observation, though seemingly mundane, carried subtle insight. The villagers, aware of his presence, but not particularly curious, simply went about their business, knowing that their lives would be quietly documented in lines of ink that no one outside the village would ever read. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the hills, diffused by the lingering rain clouds that had passed through the night. The village stirred almost imperceptibly, not with urgency, but with gentle recognition that the day had begun. Children rose from straw mats, stretching quietly, their movements synchronized with the soft creak of sliding doors. Mothers prepared the morning meal, stirring porridge over smoldering embers, occasionally glancing at the sky to measure the likely intensity of the next rain shower. The aroma of steaming grains mixed with the faint scent of wet earth and moss, creating a calming fragrance that seemed to slow the heart rate naturally. Men in the fields already bent over the rice, water up to their calves, hands submerged in cool, muddy water, tracing the contours of their plots with practiced precision, each movement deliberate, rhythmic, hypnotic, almost musical in its repetition. A small group of monks arrived from a distant monastery, traveling by foot through winding paths and over slippery stones. The villagers greeted them with polite bows and muted curiosity, offering tea and rice cakes when possible. The monks, cloaked in robes that clung to damp skin, moved with serene deliberation. Their chants were quiet and low, blending with the rain's percussion and the wind whispering through bamboo groves. The chants were not intended to impress, nor to inspire dramatic feeling, but to punctuate the day in a consistent, predictable rhythm that reminded all observers of continuity, patience, and the impermanence of excitement. In the center of the village, the blacksmith's apprentice, now familiar with the forge's pulse, struck at a piece of metal with a soft but steady rhythm, each strike measured in volume, cadence, and intention. The bellows hissed periodically, echoing faintly against the timber walls, while the master silently observed and occasionally adjusted the apprentice's grip or stance. Nothing was rushed, nothing exaggerated. The work itself was both craft and meditation, a performance of endurance without audience applause. Outside the forge, chickens scratched in designated yard patches, their movements orderly, while a cat watched from a roof beam with detached amusement, occasionally flicking its tail to express mild disapproval. The weaver continued her slow dance with thread and loom, now joined by her younger brother, who had been told by their mother that learning weaving would calm the mind and strengthen the fingers. The boy's movements were clumsy, but improving steadily under gentle correction, the shuttle gliding back and forth producing patterned fabric at a pace that allowed observation, reflection, and quiet satisfaction. The rhythmic swish of the loom mixed with the sound of rain on the roof, producing a natural symphony that required neither training nor attention to appreciate. The sound existed in harmony with life rather than in competition with it. Further down the river path, a group of villagers carried bundles of reeds and small fish baskets to the market in a nearby hamlet. Each step of their journey was synchronized by habit. The heavier baskets required slight pauses, the mud on the path demanded careful placement of feet, and the occasional passerby warranted polite acknowledgement. The journey itself was unremarkable, yet it was essential. The villagers understood instinctively that the repetition of unremarkable journeys maintained the fabric of community more than any proclamation or edict ever could. Inside homes, children practiced simple arithmetic or the basics of reading from bamboo slates. The teacher, a quiet woman with calloused hands and a soft voice, guided each child carefully, emphasizing correctness but never hurry. She recited numbers and characters rhythmically, encouraging memorization through gentle repetition rather than pressure. The children leaned in, some more attentive than others, yet all absorbed the rhythm, the cadence, the flow of words, as naturally as they absorbed the rain sound outside their windows. At the village shrine, an elder priest rearranged offerings, placed the incense more precisely, aligning the candles with an almost imperceptible tilt to match the lines of the floorboards. He whispered prayers with the same measured cadence he had employed for decades, invoking protection for crops, families, and livestock alike. He understood that his role was less about divine intervention and more about the subtle enforcement of order and continuity. The villagers observed respectfully but silently, aware that the priest's work was not urgent but perpetual. Overhead, crows occasionally shifted position, their movements deliberate yet unobtrusive. They communicated with soft calls, adding texture to the otherwise subdued soundscape of the morning. The foxes, recently returned to the forest edge, paused to observe humans from a distance, acknowledging the shared space without interference. Their presence, like the birds, reminded the villagers that life was layered in observation, patience, and mutual understanding. The river, still moving slowly, carried water toward distant paddies, occasionally gathering fallen leaves and small twigs in a delicate dance that mirrored the villagers' slow yet precise routines. The water lapped gently against banks lined with moss and small rocks, creating a steady percussion that reinforced the calm and meditative rhythm of the morning. The villagers, aware of its path and speed, intervened only when necessary to adjust irrigation channels or clear small blockages, their interventions themselves carefully measured, quiet, respectful. A traveling poet paused near a bend in the river, sketching scenes in delicate brushstrokes that captured light, shadow, and movement more than literal details. The poet's work was silent, observed only by the occasional passing villager who recognized the act as important but not urgent, perhaps more essential than anything else, for it preserved the essence of continuity, the unremarkable persistence of daily life in ink and paper. The blacksmith's apprentice, after completing a piece of ironwork, walked slowly to fetch water from a small well. The bucket rattled softly against the well's wooden rim, the sound absorbed by mud, grass, and rain. The water itself shimmered faintly, reflecting clouds that shifted lazily above. He carried it back to the forge, his movements deliberate, ensuring no spill disrupted the rhythm of the morning. The master nodded approvingly, not for the sake of achievement, but in recognition of measured consistency. Inside homes, meals were prepared with careful attention to order. The mother placed grains in bowls, adding small bits of fish or vegetables in a precise arrangement, not for aesthetic delight, but as a reflection of care and mindfulness. Each family member ate in polite silence, observing rhythms learned since birth. The youngest children mimicked the motions of elders, learning by repetition more than instruction. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, sending warmth and faint aroma of smoke into every corner, reinforcing comfort and continuity. The villagers occasionally gathered in small groups along pathways, discussing minor concerns, the likely yield of a paddock, whether rain would continue, the state of the riverbank after a recent storm. These conversations were measured, subdued, never abrupt. The exchange of information followed social rhythms as much as practical necessity. Pauses, nods, and subtle gestures maintained the decorum that allowed the community to function seamlessly. The topics themselves were mundane, but necessary, reinforcing the sense of shared responsibility, continuity, and quiet order. Even the animals contributed to the rhythm of the day. The cats prowled slowly along fences, attentive, yet unobtrusive. The chickens moved in patterns that avoided overlap. The dogs lay quietly in the shade of homes, alert but restrained. The foxes and crows remained at a distance, acknowledging human activity without interference. The rain continued its soft percussion, punctuating every action without urgency, allowing observation without distraction. By mid-morning, the villagers returned to their fields, looms, and workshops. The rhythm continued uninterrupted. The wind shifted slightly, brushing leaves against one another and creating faint whispers that merged with the rain. The apprentice weaver adjusted tension on the loom. The blacksmith lifted the hammer again. The mother stirred the pot with practiced motion, and the children counted steps in the mud as if counting stars in a quiet sky. The day existed as a meditation, the ordinary acts elevated by repetition and attention.
The night settles over the valley in a way that feels almost practiced, like it has done this sort of thing for thousands of years and could do it blindfolded if the concept of blindfolds meant anything to the night itself. The last smear of sunlight fades behind the cedar-covered ridges, leaving behind a wide, almost watery darkness that pools in the rice paddies and softens the outlines of the little homes clustered along the footpaths. It is the sort of evening in which sound seems to soak into wood, into earth, into the very air, rather than echo. Even the crickets seem to chirp a little more politely. In this village, still unnamed because most villages didn't bother giving themselves grand names unless someone important passed through, which no one here ever did, life continues with the slow, palm-shaped rhythm that has guided its people for as long as anyone's memory stretches. Generations come and go, and the village remains what it is, a collection of thatched roofs, stubborn habits, and practical concerns, knitted together by the thin threads of routine. The rain from earlier in the afternoon has already dried from the main road,
though thin beads of moisture still cling to the edges of the narrow footpaths, glinting whenever someone carrying a lantern passes by. And tonight, there are a few lanterns drifting like low, earthbound stars, the last of the villagers finishing whatever business needs doing before they retreat into their warm, smoky homes. Just to the east of the road, where the paddy embankment sloped gently toward the river, an older farmer named Sadao finishes his last inspection of the fields. He has always done this walk every evening, regardless of weather, season, or personal inconvenience. Sadao is the type of man who believes that nothing survives unless someone pays attention to it. And he also believes that if he does not personally check on the rice at the end of each day, the universe will find this an excellent opportunity to teach him a lesson. He does not trust the universe. He has seen it pull tricks on people before. He kneels near the embankment, rubbing a bit of mud between his thumb and finger, assessing its moisture as if it contains secret messages. It reads approximately, "Everything is fine. Go home." But Sadao likes to think he is dealing with a mysterious substance requiring deep interpretation. So he hums quietly to himself and pretends to consider things. A light breeze travels through the paddies, brushing the rice stalks so gently that they bend like 1,000 tiny bows. In the dim light, it almost looks as though the fields are breathing, rising and falling, rising and falling. If the village has a heartbeat, this is it, the quiet respiration of rice. A lantern glow approaches from the footpath, wobbling in a way that suggests its carrier is either short-legged, carrying too many things, or hurrying because they forgot something important. It is in fact all three. The figure is Hana, the potter's daughter, who, despite being an adult for several years now, still moves through the world with the energetic presence of someone who is permanently 3 steps behind whatever task she's trying to accomplish. She spots Sadao, waves with her free hand, and calls out, "You're still here? It's getting dark." Sato stands slowly, dusting off his knees with a faint grunt. Rice doesn't care about darkness, though this is not very relevant to the conversation, and both of them know it. Hana nods with the exaggerated seriousness of someone who would like the conversation to end so she can get back to her original mission, returning the lacquered lid she borrowed earlier from her neighbor before that neighbor has the chance to realize it is missing. They part without ceremony. The village is like that. No flourishes, no dramatic goodbyes, just a shared understanding that everyone has things to do, even when the things do not amount to much in the grand scheme of history. Farther down the path, the soft orange halo of paper lanterns illuminates the entrance of the old storehouse. The building leans slightly to one side, as if listening to the gossip drifting out from the homes along the road. The storehouse has its own personality, a little crooked, a little tired, but dependable in the way only structures older than most villagers can be. Inside, 2 men, brothers, though you wouldn't guess it from their constant bickering, are stacking bundles of thatch for roof repairs scheduled in the coming week. Or at least, that is what they are supposed to be doing. What they are actually doing is arguing about whether the sound they heard earlier was thunder, a fox knocking over a pot, or just their imagination playing tricks again. "Foxes do not knock over pots," Kenji says firmly. "Yes, they do," Masaru insists with equal conviction. "I saw one do it last summer." "You imagined it." "You always say I imagine things just because you have no imagination." "I have imagination." "Name one imaginative thing you've ever done." Kenji opens his mouth, then closes it again. The lantern flickers, perhaps in sympathy. This, too, is the rhythm of the village. Small arguments that solve nothing but fill the silence with familiar shapes. No one here is seeking enlightenment through conflict. They simply enjoy the comfortable friction of routine. Besides, the storehouse is a difficult place to stay solemn. It has a way of making any disagreement seem smaller than it felt outside. As the brothers continue their debate, the steady flow of village sounds drapes itself across the night like a soft blanket. The rhythmic thud of a pestle from someone finishing their last batch of rice flour, the gentle slosh of water as the brewer washes his tools, the distant creak of wooden shutters being closed one by one. And above it all, soft, nearly imperceptible, the rustle of wind in the bamboo beyond the river. That sound is older than any house, older than any villager, older than the roads, older than the stories people tell to explain their own existence. It is the kind of sound that reassures the living that the world was here long before them and will continue with or without their participation. The village accepts this fact calmly. To be part of something so unhurried and enduring is a privilege, not a threat. At the far edge of the settlement, where the path narrows enough that two people would have to negotiate passing each other, a small shrine stands beneath a cluster of pines. It is barely taller than a man's waist and contains a tiny wooden figure whose features have long been softened by rain, moss, and time. No one is quite sure which spirit the figure represents anymore, but everyone visits it anyway. Not out of fear or obligation, simply because it feels appropriate, like saying good morning to a neighbor. Tonight, a traveling monk stands before the shrine, palms together, head bowed. His robes are simple, his sandals worn to the point of resembling suggestions rather than actual pieces of footwear. He whispers something, though no one is around to hear it, except perhaps the spirit in the small wooden house. When he finishes, he steps back, breathing deeply as though tasting the air. He has wandered from village to village for many seasons now, and each place seems to give him something different, some small fragment of the world that he tucks away like a pebble in his sleeve. This village gives him silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that feels full, like a cup filled to the brim with still water. He turns toward the road, considering whether he should stay the night or continue walking. The night answers for him by sending a cool gust of wind that rustles through the pines with a sound not unlike a friendly suggestion. Stay. Rest. The road will still be here tomorrow. And so he does. Meanwhile, back toward the center of the settlement, the glow of household hearths deepens as families gather inside. Thin threads of smoke curl upward from chimneys like delicate strokes of ink from an invisible brush. The air smells faintly of miso soup, grilled river fish, and the faint sweetness of chestnuts roasting somewhere in the distance. Inside one home, an elderly woman named Tomiko sits by the fire sorting through bundles of dried herbs. Her fingers move with a slow competence. She knows these plants by feel alone. She sorts some for tea, some for healing salves, some for whatever ailments the villagers will inevitably bring her in the coming weeks. A child sits beside her, watching the movements with wide eyes. "What's that one for?" the child asks, pointing at a particularly knobby root. "Stubborn coughs," Tomiko says, "and that? Stubborn husbands." The child giggles. The herb is actually for sore joints, but the joke works better, and Tomiko believes in the healing power of laughter at least as much as she believes in the roots themselves. All through the village, similar small scenes unfold, quiet, warm, unremarked.
Dawn in the valley does not arrive all at once. It never has. Instead, it seeps gradually out of the forested ridges like steam escaping from a lidded pot. Quiet, hesitant, testing the air to make sure it will be welcomed. The world is still blue-gray when the first hints of light press against the thatched rooftops, drawing soft lines along their ridges. Shadows stretch, then soften,
then sigh themselves awake. For a long moment, nothing moves. The village appears almost suspended in time, as if even the birds have decided that the new day can wait a little longer. But the mist, always less patient, begins its slow climb from the river. It drapes itself across the paddies in loose swirling ribbons, curling around fence posts and drifting through open windows like an absent-minded guest who lets itself in. Inside his small home, Sadao, the same Sadao who inspected the rice the night before with the suspicious dedication of someone convinced the natural world is out to test him, blinks awake to the faintest creak of bamboo outside his window. For several seconds, he remains perfectly still, listening. The village is at its quietest in this fragile pre-dawn hour, and Sadao likes to rise before it truly wakes. He claims that the early morning has secrets it only shares with those who show up before everyone else. He rolls off his bedding, stretches, and steps outside into the chilled air, the wooden floor just barely warm from the lingering heat of the hearth. His joints complain. They always do, but quietly, like well-trained children who know better than to make a scene at this hour. The mist greets him by slipping around his ankles like a friendly cat. The paddies are barely visible beyond the path, just vague shapes lurking beneath the fog. Sadao takes this as a sign of good luck. He considers anything that obscures his daily responsibilities to be good luck. Not far away, Hana is also awake, but unlike Sadao, she is awake for unintentional reasons. Her mother sent her out before sunrise to fetch water, believing, quite optimistically, that Hana would move quickly if given a simple, direct task. And she might have, if not for the frog. The frog is sitting squarely in the center of the bucket path, large, solemn, and very much unwilling to move. Hana stands before it like someone engaged in complex negotiations. "I need to pass," she says quietly, as though politeness might help. The frog blinks. "You're sitting exactly where I need to walk." Another blink. Hana sighs dramatically, because even at dawn she has flair, and begins circling around the frog in an exaggerated detour that nearly takes her into someone's vegetable patch. The frog remains motionless, content in its unshakable belief that the road belongs to it. At the riverbank, Hana kneels and fills the buckets one by one, the icy water biting at her fingers. She works slowly, not out of laziness, but because she enjoys these early hours. The river sounds different before sunrise, gentler, as if it has not yet decided how fast it wants to rush today. Across the water, the early bird fisherman, an elderly man known only as Jisan, because none of the children ever bothered learning his real name, casts his line with the precision that could only have come from 50 years of doing the same thing every morning. He nods at Hana, acknowledging her presence without speaking, because everyone in the village understands that the river's first hour of the day deserves silence. In the center of the settlement, smoke begins to rise lazily from a few chimneys. Not many, just enough to suggest that the day is beginning to stretch, to yawn, to consider putting both feet on the ground. The scent of charred pine fills the air, carried gently by the still-forming wind. Tomiko, the herbalist, is the next to awake. Her bones, unlike Sadao's, do not complain. They make formal, legal objections. She mutters back at them as she lights her morning fire, her motions practiced, her hands steady even at her age. She prepares water for tea, drops a few leaves of something that smells faintly of citrus and earth, and waits for the brew to darken. A soft knock sounds at her door. It is the traveling monk from the night before. He bows deeply, apologetically, the way only monks and overly polite merchants do. "I hope I am not disturbing your morning," he says. "You're disturbing it, but that's fine. You might as well come in." The monk laughs the gentle, breathy laugh of someone used to being scolded kindly. He enters, removes his sandals, and sits near the fire as if he had lived here for years. Tomiko pours him tea without asking what he wants. She has already decided. Outside, the pines whisper to each other, shaking thin droplets of dew from their branches. A few birds begin their tentative test chirps, the kind that sound like they're checking if anyone is listening. The mist continues to rise, gathering itself like a great pale river flowing upward. The brothers at the storehouse, Kenji and Masaru, arrive at their duties with the exact timing of two people who spent the night pretending they weren't waiting for the other to wake them first. They exchange glances that say, without words, "You're late," even though both know they are equally responsible. Masaru yawns so dramatically that a passing chicken startles. Kenji smacks him on the shoulder. "If you'd slept earlier, you wouldn't be tired." "I wasn't tired then." "You're tired now." "That's different." The argument continues as they enter the storehouse, accompanied by the faint scrape of wooden beams settling into the new day. Toward the northern edge of the village, where the homes grow sparse and the forest begins to reclaim the path, the shrine sits quietly beneath the pines. The small wooden figure inside, its identity long forgotten, gleams with tiny beads of morning moisture. The monk approaches the shrine with the soft care of someone touching an old friend. He bows again, hands pressing together. "Thank you for last night," he murmurs. There is no answer, of course, but the breeze shifts, and for a moment the mist curls in a way that almost looks like a nod. People in this village don't need their spirits to speak. Presence alone is enough. Back at the river, Hana finishes filling her buckets and begins the careful uphill walk back towards the settlement. Her steps are slow, not out of concern for spilling the water, but because she has spotted the frog again, somehow now waiting halfway up the road. They stare at each other. Hana sighs. "You win." She takes another dramatic detour. By now, the mist is lifting enough for the rice fields to reappear, glowing faintly green under the early sunlight. The paddies sparkle with scattered droplets left over from the night, a constellation spread across the earth instead of the sky. Sadao stands by the embankment, hands on his hips, glaring at the field with the intensity of someone expecting rice to misbehave whenever unobserved. He looks over his shoulder and sees Hana struggling with the buckets. "Why are you walking like that?" he asks. "There's a frog." Sadao looks down the path, spotting nothing. "It's a big frog," Hana clarifies. Sadao grunts in a way that does not express disbelief exactly, just resignation. Life is always full of inconvenient frogs. One by one, other villagers begin appearing, a carpenter with his tool belt, the brewer with sleeves rolled high, a mother tying her son's hair into a small topknot he will undo 3 times before noon, a girl sweeping her doorstep with the faded broom her mother used when she was a child. The village stretches, the village blinks, the village begins its morning without ceremony or announcement. A rooster crows, extremely late. Someone across the settlement yells, "You're useless!" The rooster crows again defensively, and just like that, the village is fully awake. This day will be like many before it, quiet, slow, shaped by the small routines that make up most of human life. There will be chores and meals and gossip and arguments over nothing. There will be laughter somewhere and an injury somewhere else, and the faint ringing of carpentry tools near midday. History rarely writes about days like this. But these are the days most people lived. These are the days that built the world. These are the days that carried the centuries gently forward. And in this small village, tucked beneath pine-covered ridges and wrapped in drifting morning mist, the unremarkable becomes the foundation of everything. By mid-morning, the light has settled into a steady gold, the kind that spreads gently across the rooftops without demanding attention. It warms the thatch, encourages the smoke from kitchen fires to rise in clean, thin threads, and reveals just how uneven the footpaths have become after last night's rain. No one comments on the unevenness, of course. The paths have always been uneven. They will always be uneven. That is the natural order of things. Sadao steps into the paddy with the slow commitment of someone entering a bath that is slightly colder than anticipated. The mud embraces his ankles with a soft, sucking sound, welcoming, but with enthusiasm he does not appreciate. He sighs, picks up his bundle of seedlings, and begins planting them one by one. Each movement is deliberate. Plant, press, smooth. Plant, press, smooth. A rhythm older than memory, requiring no thought and offering no surprises. A dragonfly skims across the water, wings catching the sunlight as if trying to show off. Sadao ignores it. He has long since developed immunity to all forms of natural beauty that dare to interrupt his concentration. Further down the path, the brewer, Yoshinori, steps out of his workshop carrying 2 buckets that slosh faintly with the liquid he swears will become excellent sake any day now. He says this every day. The villagers quietly suspect he has been saying it every day for the last decade. Yoshinori claims the trick to brewing is patience. Most people believe the trick is ignoring how many mistakes he makes. He walks to the stream to rinse his ladles, humming a tuneless melody that wanders up and down without settling on anything recognizable. The birds respond with more structured songs, as if correcting him. Near the center of the village, the carpenter, Daigo, sharpens his tools with the focused posture of someone carving meaning from every stroke. His whetstone rests on a block of cedar, its surface cool and smooth. As he pulls the blade across the stone, the sound is soft, steady, almost soothing, a clear contrast to the distant laughter of the children who have decided the morning is the perfect time to chase each other around the shrine, despite 3 warnings not to. The shrine's priest steps outside, watching the children run in circles with the resigned patience of a man who has accepted his battle with childhood energy is unwinnable. He sends a half-hearted scolding in their direction. "Not in front of the altar, please." The children nod gravely and then continue doing exactly what they were doing. Behind the shrine, the pines rustle softly, their long needles brushing together in a whispering chorus. The breeze carries the scent of sap and damp bark, mixing with the faint sweetness of the incense that burns perpetually inside the temple's small hall. It is a scent that belongs to this place, one that follows villagers from childhood to old age, a gentle reminder that time passes, but not quickly. At the edge of the village, a young mother named Rika kneels beside a row of vegetables, inspecting the leaves with the concentration of someone searching for hidden treasure. Her child sits nearby, attempting to imitate her movements, but mostly just poking the dirt with a stick. Rika pauses occasionally to wipe sweat from her brow, even though the morning has barely warmed. The work is quiet, repetitive, grounding, exactly the kind of work that passes unnoticed by history, but keeps families alive. The traveling monk, who has now been adopted by the village in the unspoken way these things happen, sits beneath the shade of an old persimmon tree, repairing a tear in his robe. His stitches are small and neat. He sews with the peaceful certainty of a man who has mended far more robes than he has worn out. Every so often he looks up to watch the villagers, smiling at their small routines. He has seen dozens of villages like this, but each one feels distinct in the way families are distinct, different in small, unimportant ways that matter deeply to the people who live there. Near the well, Hana recounts her morning battle with the frog to anyone willing to listen. Each retelling is slightly more dramatic. In the latest version, the frog refused to yield territory and stared her down with the confidence of a minor warlord. The other children listen with wide eyes, impressed. Adults passing by try not to laugh. Masaru and Kenji, still at the storehouse, decide to take a break far earlier than necessary. They sit on the wide steps with rice crackers and dried persimmons. Masaru insists that eating early gives him energy. Kenji insists that Masaru just likes excuses. Their banter is light, friendly, and familiar. 2 brothers whose disagreements never escalate beyond mild annoyance. The potter, Yon, begins shaping clay at her wheel. Her hands are steady but unhurried, guiding each curve with patient intention. The wheel turns slowly, the clay rising and falling as it yields beneath her touch. She hums a rhythm older than the village, something passed down from her grandmother, who likely learned it from someone whose name is long forgotten. The sound blends with the wheel's soft spin, creating a small pocket of peace around her. In the distance, the forest shifts, not loudly, never loudly, but with a deep, creaking sigh that ripples through its cedar and maple limbs. Birds launch in small bursts, scattering before settling again. A deer steps delicately through the undergrowth, ears flicking, tail twitching. It pauses near the boundary of the village, watching the humans with mild curiosity before returning to its path. The villagers notice but do not react. The deer come and go as they please. The morning advances, but only gently. No rush, no urgency. In the rice field, Sadao straightens his back, winces, and looks out over the paddy with a slow nod of approval. The seedlings stand in neat rows, reflecting the sky in their shallow pools. He grunts, satisfied but not surprised. This is how mornings go. Reliable, steady, ordinary. And ordinary is enough. The sun climbs higher, gaining strength but not heat, the kind of sun that prefers to watch rather than perform. Its light catches the edges of woven baskets, shines through the translucent leaves of the taro plants, and glitters briefly on the river's surface before dissolving into ripples. Life continues, softly, quietly, without announcement. And it is in this quiet that the shape of the day unfolds, spreading like slow-moving water across the hours ahead.
By the time the sun begins its gentle slide toward the western ridge, the village has settled into the kind of calm that only arrives after lunch. Not a heavy lunch, of course. Peasants rarely indulged in anything extravagant, but enough rice, miso, and pickled vegetables to soften the edges of the day. The heat that follows midday is mild but steady, the kind that convinces even the most energetic children to sit down for a moment and reconsider their life choices. A few of them cluster in the shade of the carpenter's workshop, carving sticks with dull knives under the loosely supervised eye of Daigo. He pretends to watch them while polishing a plank, but everyone knows he is only half paying attention. Luckily, the children's knives are so blunt that the chance of injury is extremely low. They could cut a block of tofu, maybe, a determined radish, but nothing else. Near the river, the monk sits on a smooth boulder with his sleeves rolled up, letting the cool water run over his feet. He hums a low chant, not quite a melody, not quite a prayer, just a quiet vibration that matches the river's pace. The air around him feels a little cooler, a little softer, the way it tends to around people who carry serenity like an extra layer of clothing. A few paces away, Jizon the fisherman empties his woven traps with the slow resignation of someone who has caught nothing especially impressive. Again. He lifts one small fish between his fingers and sighs. You, he mutters, are not worth telling stories about. The fish flicks its tail in weak protest. He drops it into a bucket with its equally unimpressive companions. Dinner will be fine, just not memorable, which describes most meals in this village and most meals in most villages in most centuries. Back near the heart of the settlement, Tomiko the herbalist arranges bundles of drying plants across a bamboo tray. She sorts each one by color, texture, and imagined personality, muttering to herself about which herbs are cooperative and which ones think too highly of themselves. She talks to plants the same way other people talk to pets. The plants, of course, do not respond, but they dry nicely all the same. Next door, the blacksmith and his apprentice return to the forge after their meal.
The apprentice moves with slightly exaggerated enthusiasm, as though trying to impress the iron tools themselves. The master simply steps into the workshop, rolls his shoulders, and lifts the hammer as if greeting an old friend. The forge resumes its low, steady breathing. The fire wakes. The hiss of metal meeting water punctuates the afternoon like slow, steady punctuation marks. Across the path, Yone the potter has placed several new bowls in the sun to firm before firing. She sits beside them with her knees pulled to her chest, watching for imperfections. Occasionally, she nudges one bowl forward or tilts another slightly, making adjustments so subtle that only she can see why they matter. Children walk by and ask, "Can we touch one?" She replies instantly, "No." A few minutes pass. Another child tries, "What if we only touch it gently?" "No." "What if?" "No." She doesn't even look up. The negotiations end there. At the northern edge of the village, Rika checks the vegetables again. Not because they need checking, but because gardening gives her an excuse to stand quietly while her toddler stacks small stones into a tower that will inevitably collapse. The child works with deep seriousness, tongue poking slightly out from concentration, as if constructing a castle. When the stones fall, the child gasps, then immediately starts rebuilding with the same determination. Rika smiles softly. Repetition is the foundation of childhood, and of adulthood too, only the toys change. In the paddies, the water glimmers between rows of seedlings. The breeze carries the scent of mud, fresh growth, and a trace of pine resin drifting down from the hills. Sadao wades deeper into the field, turning the soil with slow, measured movements that feel almost ceremonial. His focus is total, absolute, though perhaps not entirely by choice. If he loses focus, he'll faceplant into the mud. Dignity, while not his strongest trait, is something he still tries to protect. A farmer from a neighboring plot walks by and calls out, "Your rows are crooked again." Sadao looks up, squints, and replies with the confidence of someone definitely lying. "They're supposed to be like that." The other farmer nods, equally unconvinced, but continues walking. No one in the village wastes energy arguing about something that will grow no matter what. Nearby, a pair of teenage boys attempt to patch a section of the irrigation channel. They work with the casual efficiency of people who have done the task 100 times and will almost certainly do it 100 more. One shovels, the other packs the mud, and both pause periodically to swat flies. Neither speaks much. Conversation would imply urgency. In the distance, a lone deer steps to the edge of the forest again. Its ears flick as it observes the humans for a long moment, then lowers its head to nibble at young grass. A crow, offended by the intrusion, makes a loud complaint from a branch above. The deer ignores it. The crow complains louder. The deer remains unmoved, a creature deeply committed to not caring. The village, accustomed to both animals, pays them no attention. As the afternoon deepens, a soft sluggishness spreads across the fields and homes. Even those working with purpose begin to slow. Afternoon is not a time for rushing. Afternoon is for continuing, nothing more. The monk eventually rises from the riverbank, drying his feet on the edge of his robe, which Tomiko will absolutely scold him for later. He walks toward the shrine carrying a tiny bouquet of wildflowers he gathered, 2 white ones, 1 pale yellow one, and a small purple bloom that looks perpetually confused about its own existence. He places them at the shrine's base, not because anyone asked, but because offerings make the shrine feel tended to. A shrine, like a person, likes to know it hasn't been forgotten. Inside, the incense burns in thin, curling lines. The air is calm, the shadows soft. The priest finds the flowers later and smiles without saying anything. Not far away, Hana finally spots the frog again. It is sitting on top of a rock, regal, imposing, completely self-satisfied. She points at it dramatically. You again. The frog does not blink this time. It simply exists with incredible confidence. Hana informs 3 other children about her ongoing feud. They gather around the frog, observing it as though it is a rare and highly dangerous beast. After a moment, one child whispers, "Maybe it's a spirit." Another replies, "If it is, it's not a very hard-working one." The frog remains motionless, refusing to confirm or deny its divine status. The children eventually wander off to find snacks. The frog continues ruling its small rock kingdom. By late afternoon, the shadows grow longer, stretching across the paths and wrapping themselves lazily around fences and baskets. The air cools slightly. Someone begins chopping daikon for stew. Someone else starts gathering firewood. A pair of women lift laundry from the drying line, shaking out each cloth with the gentle dignity of people preparing for evening. In the center of the village, the pace of life slows still further, not to a stop, but to a glide. Nothing is urgent. Nothing is dramatic. Nothing interrupts the soft, steady breathing of the day. The village simply continues exactly as it has for generations, exactly as it will for generations more. And as the light begins its quiet descent behind the ridge, the world settles into the comfortable certainty that comes with knowing that life will unfold at its own gentle pace, without hurry, without fanfare. Just like water finding its way home. So let's just drift a little further down that narrow, muddy path, the one that curves behind the rice paddies and disappears into a cluster of cedar trees. It's early afternoon now, the kind of hour when absolutely nothing dramatic happens in a medieval Japanese village, which, honestly, is exactly why we're here. The clouds are still heavy with leftover rain, sagging like old futons, and every now and then the drop falls from a branch and lands on the sleeve of someone who is really too tired to care. This includes us, spiritually. You'll notice the silence first. Not an empty silence, but the soft, lived-in quiet of a place where people don't have the luxury of shouting unless it's harvest season or someone's goat has escaped again. Even then, the shouting is half-hearted. The goat usually wins. There's a house tucked at the edge of the trees, more like a hut, really. Its thatched roof slightly uneven from last winter's snow. The man who lives here is named Genpei, though no one calls him that. Everyone just calls him the Old One, even though he's 50, which in medieval Japan is basically ancient sage who has somehow not died of something yet. He's sitting on a low stool peeling radishes, with the same expression he uses for everything, mild acceptance that life is mostly chores with short breaks for breathing. He doesn't look up when we drift by. Genpei has long ago made peace with the idea that life is made of circles, seasons, harvests, planting, repairing the same roof that will just break again the next year, and listening to the same stories told by travelers who swear their trip was very dangerous, but somehow survived to complain about it. He enjoys the monotony. It's predictable. Predictability means survival. If you peer behind his house, you'll see a small shrine made of rough stone. No fancy carving, no dramatic deity statue, just a place to leave offerings of rice or sake when the weather feels slightly cursed. The villagers don't call it a shrine. They just call it the place you go to when the fields look weird. Official religion was often secondary to the much older practice of just-in-case spiritualism. If you lived in a world where floods, droughts, and bandits could all visit within the same week, you'd leave rice offerings too, even if the only spirit eating them is a raccoon dog with questionable morals. A little further down the path, there's a wooden bridge, or rather, the remains of a wooden bridge, because the river has decided, once again, that human engineering is adorable but ultimately optional. The water runs low today, just enough to make a sound like a whispering crowd. A boy sits on the riverbank, skipping stones with the seriousness of someone who has absolutely nothing else to do until someone forces him to fetch something. You'll notice that every time the stone sinks, he sighs, as if the universe has personally wronged him. Nobody rushes to fix the bridge. They'll get to it eventually, maybe next week, or maybe when someone falls in and everyone collectively decides the inconvenience outweighs the effort of sawing logs. Medieval Japanese peasants did not hurry unless something was literally on fire, and even then the general attitude was, well, it was bound to happen someday. Across the river, a woman hangs laundry on a bamboo pole, her sleeves tied back, her expression set in that calm, patient way people get when their entire life is repetitive necessity. She hums an old folk song, not because she particularly likes it, but because it was the one her grandmother sang, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, and that's good enough. Tradition isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just a melody that makes chores feel slightly less like chores. Let's float past her and head toward the open field beyond the houses. The soil is dark and soft from the rain, and if you look closely, you'll see footprints from the morning, sandals pressed into mud, a cartwheel groove, the delicate little paw prints of a fox probably looking for leftover fish guts. The peasants share the land with animals, spirits, weather, and each other, usually without much argument. When you spend your whole life in one village surrounded by the same faces, quietly doing the same tasks your ancestors did, your sense of identity becomes less dramatic and more steady. And steady is perfect sleep story material. Near the tall grass, a monk from the local temple is carrying a bundle of herbs. His robe is patched but clean, and his shoulders droop in that familiar, I have renounced material possessions but also haven't slept enough in 15 years posture. He chants under his breath as he walks, not loudly. Monks rarely needed to prove anything to the fields. He's probably collecting plants for medicine or incense, or because the temple elder told him, go do something useful before you start philosophizing again. The temple itself sits uphill, its wooden gate worn smooth by countless hands, not pilgrims, just locals stopping by to mutter a prayer, ask for luck, or drop off vegetables as an offering. The monks are part of village life, not separate from it. They farm, they teach children to read, they mend sandals, and occasionally they mediate arguments about who stole whose chicken. Enlightenment is nice, but practical problem solving is a full-time job. Let's drift inside the temple grounds. You'll hear the soft clacking of wooden prayer plaques swaying in the breeze. Many are written in wobbly handwriting, wishes like, may the harvest be good, or please keep my father from gambling, or I want more noodles this year. The gods have seen worse requests. Inside the main hole, incense curls upward in thin threads, its scent earthy and a little sweet. A novice monk sweeps the floor with that gentle determination unique to teenagers pretending they're doing important spiritual labor. He pauses occasionally to stare at nothing, a sign that he is either contemplating impermanence or simply bored. In medieval Japan, these were often the same thing. From the temple balcony, the whole village stretches below like a quiet painting. Houses arranged without symmetry, fields shaped for practicality rather than aesthetics, chickens where chickens should not be, and people who carry themselves with the weary contentment of those who expect nothing from the universe except mild inconvenience. Let's move again, this time toward the forest beyond the temple. It's dark and cool under the trees, and you can hear the distant tapping of a woodcutter's axe. He works slow, not because he's lazy, but because life has already taught him that speed rarely helps. Wood splits when it wants to split. Weather changes when it wants to change. Lords collect taxes whether the grain grew well or not. So the woodcutter simply lifts and swings, accepting that the day will pass at the pace it chooses. There's a shrine deeper in the forest, older than the village itself. The moss grows thick on the stones, and tree roots curl around them like protective arms. No priest tends it anymore, but villagers still leave offerings here when they feel a certain kind of uneasiness, the kind that comes from dreams that linger or winds that blow strangely. Shinto isn't a religion of fear, it's a religion of noticing. Noticing when something feels off, noticing when something feels right, noticing when your rice wine cup mysteriously empties itself and blaming the fox spirits instead of your neighbor. As evening approaches, the air cools and a soft blue begins to settle over the fields. Villagers return home one by one, their sandals slapping lightly against the ground. A few children chase fireflies, even though their parents told them to come inside an hour ago. Fireflies don't care about bedtime, neither do children. Nature and disobedience often work as a team. Dinner smells drift through the air. Miso soup, millet porridge, maybe a grilled fish if someone was lucky that day. The meals aren't luxurious, but they're warm, filling, and shared. Most peasants don't eat alone. Eating alone was for monks deep in meditation or samurai sulking about something. Inside the houses, the lanterns glow like little stars. The thatched roofs creak softly as they dry. Someone coughs in the distance. Someone else laughs. A baby cries, then quiets. Life moves gently, without sharp corners. And just as night settles fully across the village, the cicadas begin their low, steady hum, that perfect, infinite loop that sounds like summer pressing its hand over the world's heartbeat. If you weren't sleepy before, this is usually the part where the mind softens. Medieval nights were quiet, repetitive, predictable. No bright lights, no clocks, no work shifts, just the slow dissolving of the day into darkness. Let's drift a little longer.
Night has fully settled now, but it isn't the kind of night that feels heavy or ominous. It's the softer sort, the one that settles over the village like a blanket that smells faintly of smoke and damp straw. The lanterns inside the houses flicker gently, doing their best even though the oil in them is always just a little lower than ideal. But peasants are used to less than ideal. It's the unofficial national motto of every farming community in history. The paths between the houses glow a dull amber from those lanterns, just enough light to walk without stepping on something, but not enough to see whatever strange little shapes scurry across the ground. People pretend not to notice. If it isn't attacking your food supply or biting your foot, it isn't worth the energy to worry about. A few men sit outside one of the houses around a tiny fire that barely qualifies as a fire. It's more like a polite suggestion of flame. They talk in low voices, not about important things. Peasants rarely talk about national politics because national politics rarely talks about them. Instead, they discuss the weather, the stubborn mule belonging to the neighbor, and whether the new tax collector looks like he might have a soul. Opinions are mixed. One of the men whittles a piece of wood with a small knife, the shavings curling like pale petals onto the ground. He's not making anything in particular. Peasants often carve things just to keep their hands busy, the same way modern people scroll on their phones without knowing why. The mind needs something quiet to settle on. Inside the nearby houses, you can hear families preparing to sleep. Bedding is unrolled, thin mats laid over slightly less thin straw. A mother scolds a child gently for tracking mud inside. A grandfather clears his throat in that dramatic, overly loud way older men do when they want the room to know they still exist. Someone somewhere plucks a shamisen, slowly and imperfectly. The melody drifts into the air like a memory that didn't fully form. No one complains about the off notes. Complaining takes energy, and energy is a resource saved for harvesting season and emergencies involving livestock.
Let's drift to the river again. At night, it becomes something else entirely. Still shallow, still slow, but now reflective like a sheet of black glass. You can see the moon rippling slightly on the surface, as though the sky placed a mirror there just to check its appearance. Frogs croak from the reeds with the persistence of creatures that believe they are performing at a grand concert. A fisherman stands knee-deep in the water, holding a small torch attached to a basket. He's night fishing for IU, though fishing might be a generous term. It's mostly waiting and pretending to be optimistic. His face is calm, almost bored, which is exactly how a man looks when he has spent his entire life doing this and will continue doing it until the universe or his knees decide otherwise. If you look toward the horizon, you'll see lightning flickering silently behind distant mountains. Summer storms travel like restless travelers, never staying long, but always reminding people they exist. The villagers notice them, but don't rush inside. Rain is a normal visitor. Only the samurai cared about dramatic weather because thunderstorms made their war banners look cool. Peasants just wanted dry socks. Let's float toward the temple again. At night, it feels almost sacred, but not in an intimidating ancient wisdom way. More like a quiet place where even the insects lower their volume. A monk sits at the entrance, spinning a prayer wheel slowly, his expression caught somewhere between serenity and mild exhaustion. Enlightenment seems lovely in theory, but in practice, it requires a lot of chores. He notices us the same way he notices the wind, quietly and without surprise. Monks in medieval Japan accepted that the world was full of strange presences, spirits, animals, travelers, occasional hallucinations from lack of sleep. Everything blends together after a while, and none of it feels alarming when your daily responsibilities include both spiritual guidance and cleaning gutters. There's a bell inside the temple, large, bronze, and older than the oldest villagers' memories. It's rung at dawn and dusk, not because it changes anything, but because rituals give shape to days that might otherwise blur together. Even peasants who don't consider themselves particularly religious pause when they hear it, not to pray, but simply because the sound is comforting in a world where little else stays consistent. Speaking of consistent, a group of children gathers near the temple steps, ignoring the monks' attempts at dignity. They're catching moths, but gently, because their parents told them that harming things that glow or flutter might anger the wrong spirit. Children take this extremely seriously. Fear of supernatural consequences is far more effective than go to your room, especially when your room is just a mat and a drafty wall. Let's drift back toward the houses as the night deepens. The last fires are dimming, the voices fading. A dog barks once, then twice, then apparently forgets what it was barking about and lies down again. A rooster, confused by the lantern light, crows prematurely before being shushed by an annoyed farmer. Inside one home, an elderly woman is telling a bedtime story, an old folktale about a fox spirit who tricked a merchant into marrying her. The children listen with wide eyes, not scared, but enchanted. Folktales were less about fear and more about explaining the universe in ways that made emotional sense. Spirits weren't villains. They were neighbors with unpredictable personalities. By now, the village is settling into the slower rhythm of sleep. Not everyone sleeps at once. Someone is always up, tending a fire or mending a tool or dealing with a newborn who has decided night is the perfect time for loud existential commentary. But overall, the village breathes as one organism, inhaling warmth, exhaling silence. Even the insects adjust their sounds, shifting into a deeper tone that feels almost like a natural lullaby. You could fall asleep right here, listening to the rhythmic clatter of a shutter in the wind, the soft snores from inside the houses, and the occasional muffled complaint from someone whose straw mattress is poking them in the wrong place. Medieval Japan wasn't peaceful because life was easy. It was peaceful because there was no energy to waste on anything unnecessary. People accepted the world as it was and adapted, quietly and consistently. And that quiet,
mundane, repetitive, imperfect, creates the perfect ending note for a sleepy night.
Let's settle into the quiet just a little longer, because in a medieval village like this, the night doesn't hurry. The darkness doesn't chase anyone. It just sits there patiently, like an old friend who has shown up uninvited but is too polite to be a bother. The moon hangs low over the fields, casting that soft silver glow that makes everything look slightly more poetic than it deserves. Even mud looks dignified under moonlight, which really tells you the moon's standards are not overly strict. Most of the houses have gone dark now. Only a few lanterns remain lit, glowing through the thin paper walls like warm, diffused fireflies. Inside one home, a young mother rocks her baby gently, humming a tune that doesn't have a name and never will. It's the kind of half-song mothers invent instinctively, built from pieces of memory and instinct, stitched together just well enough to quiet a fussy child. Her voice is soft, barely above a whisper, but the rhythm carries through the room like a heartbeat. On the far side of the village, an older couple sits together beside their tiny indoor hearth. They're not talking. After 40 years of marriage, they've essentially said everything that needs saying. Now they just sit in companionable silence, each pretending they aren't falling asleep sitting upright. The fire crackles quietly, sending up a small trail of smoke that curls lazily into the dark rafters. The husband nods off first, chin dipping toward his chest in that universal, "I wasn't sleeping, I was thinking deeply" emotion. His wife gives him a gentle tap with the back of her fingers, the kind that means, "Go to bed before you fall into the fire." And he grunts in agreement. Just outside, a cat slinks across the path, tail twitching, clearly on some important mission known only to cats. It pauses next to a stack of firewood, ears perked, as if listening to the night for instructions. Then, satisfied that everything is sufficiently mysterious, it moves on. Cats in medieval Japan had no formal job description, but they acted like they ran the place anyway. Let's glide toward the rice paddies again. At night, the shallow water becomes a perfect mirror for the sky. You can see the stars reflected there, shimmering slightly whenever the wind brushes across the surface. It creates this quiet illusion that the sky has doubled itself, one above and one below, just in case anyone needed extra reassurance. A frog croaks somewhere in the reeds, and another answers it, and suddenly you have an entire amphibian choir arguing politely about territory. In the distance, a farmer walks along the embankment carrying a small lantern. He's checking the water channels, a nightly ritual during growing season. He moves slowly, not out of caution, but because rushing would be pointless in a job ruled entirely by patience. His sandals make soft, squishing sounds with every step, and he pauses occasionally to adjust the flow of water with a bamboo tool. Farming was less about controlling nature and more about negotiating with it, one quiet moment at a time. A little further along, an elderly woman kneels in the doorway of her house, folding cloths by lantern light. Her hands move with practiced ease, smoothing each fabric square with a tender care that you usually reserve for something you've had to repair 1,000 times. Every cloth in this village has lived multiple lives, first as a kimono, then as a garment lining, then as a rag, then as something else altogether. Peasants didn't throw things away. They simply reincarnated them in increasingly humble roles, which is possibly the most practical form of spirituality ever invented. From the forest edge, an owl hoots, low, steady, unbothered. It sounds a little like a grumpy grandfather commenting on the weather. The villagers know the owls well enough to distinguish them by personality. There's the friendly one who nests near the shrine, the easily startled one who drops feathers everywhere, and the one who sounds like he's mildly offended by everything happening around him. Tonight's hoot belongs to that last owl. Let's drift inside another home nearby. A teenage boy lies on his futon staring at the ceiling, clearly awake,
clearly annoyed that sleep hasn't claimed him yet. He's thinking about something irrelevant, but deeply important to him. Maybe a girl he saw at the last market day, or whether he'll ever be allowed to handle the family's only decent tool, or why his father always looks disappointed even when nothing is happening. Peasant adolescence was basically the same as modern adolescence, just with fewer snacks and more responsibility. Across the room, his younger sister sleeps curled beneath a blanket, one hand clutching a woven doll with lopsided eyes. She snores slightly, that faint whistling kind of snore that sounds like a kettle that hasn't decided whether it wants to boil. His parents sleep nearby, wrapped in their own blankets, breathing slow and deep. The whole room feels warm despite the cool night air, insulated by bodies, straw, and the simple comfort of everyone being under one roof. Let's float past the open windows again. There's a breeze moving through the village now, carrying the scent of damp earth, smoldering firewood, and a little hint of plum blossoms from the trees at the outskirts. The air is fresh in that uncomplicated, untreated way. No pollution, no city noise, no artificial lights ruining the stars. Just the world as it is, quietly existing. If you listen closely, you might hear someone chanting softly. It's an older monk walking back from the forest shrine, swinging a small bell with each step. The sound is delicate, almost tentative, as though it doesn't want to disturb the night but still feels obligated to participate. His chant is old, older than the temple, older than the village, older than most of the written records people rely on today. It drifts through the darkness like a thread of sound woven into the fabric of the night. Let's drift further now, to the edge of the village where the fields end and the wild begins. A traveler has set up a tiny camp beneath a cedar tree. He's wrapped in a cloak that's seen better years, and he's cooking something unidentifiable in a small pot over an even smaller fire. Travelers were always a bit of a curiosity in medieval villages. They brought news, stories, and the occasional flu. Villagers welcomed them cautiously, polite hospitality balanced with the practical understanding that strangers often came with problems. This traveler mutters to himself as he cooks, poking the pot with a stick as though the stew might answer him. His horse grazes nearby, equally unimpressed. When the man finally sits back and sips the stew, he nods as if it meets his very low expectations. Travelers rarely had high coronary standards. Above him, the trees sway gently as the wind picks up. Leaves rustle like distant whispers, and the night carries on with its slow, methodical rhythm. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing startling, just a seamless continuation of existence, hour after hour, breath after breath. Eventually, the village settles into that deep, collective sleep where even the restless ones give up the fight. The moon drifts across the sky like a lazy guardian watching over fields and rooftops. The clouds thin a little. The stars sharpen their edges. The world becomes simple again. This is the heart of medieval peasant life. Quiet, patient, repetitive, but not empty. Full of tiny moments that never made it into the grand epics or heroic chronicles. But these were the moments that shaped actual life. The rhythm, the warmth, the small annoyances, the shared routines, the unspoken comforts. And as the night deepens, the village breathes again. One long inhale, one long exhale. Like a living thing made of wood, straw, laughter, chores, and generations of footsteps pressed into the earth.